Okay. Yeah, so this is group one, discussion three. This is Kevin Cronin,
Greg Allen.
and let's just jump right into our creative responses. So, what I did my creative response on was the school to prison pipeline and how it's kind of connected to the idea of redlining. So, minority and impoverished schools in impoverished neighborhoods and things of that nature. Um, Less funding based on like a line on a map that kind of dictates where the funding is going to go and things of that nature. So it ties into the school to prison pipeline in the fact that these kids aren't getting the educational requirements that they or the educational equipment that they need in order to progress in their education. And because of that, they kind of turn their back on the educational system because, in a sense, it's failing them. And then with like the implementation of like the zero tolerance policies in the schools, these kids will then get arrested in the school and just basically shipped directly into the prison system. So like the fact that like the educational system is almost letting them down is causing them to fall into a life of basically inhabiting the prison system. Um, that was like the sort of general concept of what I did.
I
Did you
lost
hear
you a
me?
little
Am
bit.
I not coming?
I lost you a little bit at the end there. It got a little fuzzy, but
Oh, okay.
but for the most part, you were all right. Yeah. So I talked in my creative response a little bit about something similar, where I looked at the school to prison pipeline and really compared it to other issues of institutional racism within our country. You look at the school to prison pipeline, and most of it is lower income or African American students who are essentially being targeted and punished more harshly for the same behavioral issues or the same crimes per se. And another area where we saw this was in the war on drugs. And I looked at a documentary called 13th, and it talked about how during the war on drugs, users of crack were um, criminalized more often and for longer sentences than people who used cocaine, even though it's essentially the same exact drug. Um, the difference is crack is a little bit cheaper, so it's used by more people of lower incomes, and um, whereas cocaine is more expensive, so it's used by more middle to upper class people. So the police and the law enforcement are essentially targeting crack because it's used by the people that they want to see in prison. And I thought that was very similar to the school to prison pipeline, in the sense that they want to get people of lower incomes and people of different ethnicities, mostly African American and Hispanic. Those are the people that the system wants in jail per se. So the system is working quite effectively in that way. So it's a crazy concept, and our criminal justice system is clearly pretty flawed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just
I was just gonna say that was pretty much the gist of my creative response.
yeah, yeah. I mean, going off of one of the points that you just made, like I put a video link in my creative response that kind of gave like a little bit of a like an overview of how the school to prison pipeline works.
Hmm.
And one of the points that they made is basically what you just said, where like African American and minority students are um, basically 3 times more likely. I believe that was the statistic. Yeah, so they're like about 3 times more likely to get in trouble than their like white um, sort of neighbors, I guess.
Yeah. Classmates,
Just
colleagues.
yeah, and they're like 3 times more likely to get in trouble for the same thing, which is flawed. But so I guess just since we were already on this sort of topic, I guess we could just go right into
Yeah.
the how does the well one of the professor's questions, how does the schools to prison pipeline work? What are the larger social factors that contribute to the phenomenon? And how can the schools respond?
Yeah, so I think we touched on a lot of this already.
Mhm.
But essentially, the I think the school to prison pipeline is this trend that students are going from schools to directly to juvenile centers or and ultimately jails and prisons too regularly and too often. And I think the reason that we're seeing this is because it ensures that there are enough people in jail to make a profit. They want more. The more people they have in there, the more money they're ultimately going to make. So I think it's all part of this idea in America where making money is more important than the lives of people, and in this case, students. Um, Something that I thought was really interesting about this trend was how we're even making schools just like prisons now, in the sense that there are guards and police officers and metal detectors, and in the video we saw kids saying it takes 20 minutes just to get into their school and it doesn't feel like a school environment. And another point that I thought was really interesting was the fact that in lower income schools where there's not as much funding in the budget, um, we're seeing this more often where kids are just going to juvenile centers and to jails because they might not have the funding for a good social worker who can sit down with the student and try to find the root of the problem, or the guidance counselors aren't well equipped enough and don't have enough resources or enough time to really sit with students, figure out what the source of the problem is. So instead they just suspend them, and then the kids go home and are on the streets, or they ship them out to a juvenile center. So it's a really flawed system, I think, that ultimately comes down to not having enough funding and not having enough resources to be able to really give a kid what he needs to figure out the source of the issue.
Yeah. I mean, just kind of like you said, we did kind of touch on a little bit of this in the initial sort of discussion, but like yeah, I mean, it's kind of like an odd kind of where I live. There's a school, Monroe Woodbury,
Yep.
and like basically the one of the interesting things that I was thinking about is that the person who like sort of developed the school, like the architect in this area, and that's just kind of like a weird sort of concept to me. Is like because if you ever seen the school, it literally looks so it's kind of like the same layout. It like it's just like a big sort of just doesn't have the barbed wire or anything around it.
Yeah.
Um, and that was just like a thing that I was sort of like thinking about, just in terms of the school to prison pipeline, is that like it seems like almost that schools are being created to be an area where certain people go there just to get the idea of how a prison works, because they're going to just basically be shifted to a prison.
That's where they yeah.
Yeah, it's just like a weird sort of concept. I mean, based on like the question like of how schools can respond, I would say, um, yeah, just like have like I mean maybe like get rid of the zero tolerance policy. I mean, because these kids are literally kids, um, and kids make tons of mistakes. That's like the whole concept of being a kid. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, speaking from experience, that was pretty much all I ever did when I was a kid, was just make dismal life choices.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you've got to like almost like um, in another class, I read a Martin Luther King um, sermon, I think it was. I believe it was called what was it called? Tough Mind, Tender Heart, and it's basically just like you have to expect the kids, like you have to sort of put a sort of level that they have to sort of aspire to reach to, but also have compassion for them. Don't just be like, oh, well, this one's a bad apple. We have to punish this one in order
Right.
to,
Suspend
yeah,
them. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, because like, yeah, punishing kids just kind of it's not beneficial to anyone. Like the idea of education is that you're supposed to be able to teach everyone. You can't just be like, oh, well, this one's not good enough and we have to send him to
Yeah.
prison. So, yeah, I mean, I guess just have a little bit more compassion for kids, especially if they don't have the sort of educational opportunities that they should be receiving.
I think something too that's important as aspiring teachers and for teachers now is to just ask questions. You never know what somebody has going on at home or what somebody's going through. So if a teacher could just ask questions and be there and be a system of support for a student, it could really go a long way. I substitute teach right now, and I was on in-school suspension duty the other day, and a teacher dropped off this one kid and said, so and so is having a really bad morning, so he's just gonna come in here with you for a little while. So I sat down with him and I started talking to him, just asking him questions about all sorts of different things, and he was kind of giving me one-word answers, but I think that I was comforting him a little bit, and I think it was nice for him to hear somebody ask him about what he does, what his interests are, what video games he likes, and things like that. Because it seemed like, anytime a teacher was talking to him, he was just getting in trouble. So I think it was comforting for him to hear, somebody interested in his life. So that was a pretty neat experience for me. Um, so I don't have too much else to say about the school to prison pipeline. So if you want to move on.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we could jump to the other teacher professor question.
Yeah.
Okay, so that one was what are some principles of teaching and development that Piaget and Vygotsky have differing ideas about? How do you plan to use their ideas in your own teaching?
Yeah. So, Piaget, as we talked about before, his whole idea is that humans are trying to adapt to the environment by making sense out of their experiences. Um, I think it said something along those lines in the reading, and it's pretty much, I mean, as far as it goes with learning, Piaget believes that students think more like scientists, um, where there's a logical process involved, instead of just going through a trial and error process or something. um, and then well, I'm just looking at my notes here. um, Oh, and then something else that I thought was really interesting about Piaget is the idea that, as a result of their logical and methodical um, mannerisms per se, it leads to this like abstract thought which ultimately leads to adolescents becoming idealistic and seeing like a perfect world. So this makes them, you know, upset with the realistic world where there's rules and regulations and hypocrisy and double standards. So they often, rebel against these established rules and guidelines. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then ultimately, Piaget's theories and findings have led to teachers using, more hands-on and more interactive methods and models of teaching. Whereas so yeah, that's pretty much Piaget. And then if you wanted to talk a little bit about Vygotsky, I think that could be a pretty good way of attacking this.
Sorry, I sort of lost a little bit of the end there.
I was just saying, so I pretty much talked about Piaget. So if you wanted to go into Vygotsky a little bit and talk about what he was all about, I think that would be a good way of going through this.
Yeah, I mean, so what I kind of gathered a little bit from the two of them is just like the sort of social aspect of it. Like, I sort of noticed that Piaget sort of saw like development as a sort of like an individualistic thing, where like the student kind of developed and created their own sort of ideas and ways of looking at things, whereas Vygotsky kind of saw it more as like a social experience with like with the ideas of like scaffolding and the zone of proximal development and everything like that, where he sort of saw it as like the student could only do so much by themselves, and then in order to get the student to keep getting higher and higher and higher in the sort of like learning aspect of things, they would need either a teacher who knows a specific amount of information, or a peer who had a higher level of understanding than they did.
A little more advanced.
Yeah, and basically that was the concept of the zone of proximal development. Is like here's where the student is by themselves. Here's where the other student is helping them, and then that area in between is the zone of proximal development. But yeah, what I sort of noticed is that yeah, one was more Piaget was more of an individualistic kind of person,
Right.
and Vygotsky was more of a sort of social learning um, sort of theory, I suppose. Um, but I
Yeah.
guess I mean, oh nope, sorry.
Oh yeah, just going off of that real quick, I thought it was interesting. I don't remember if this was in the essay or in one of the videos, but it said that, it was talking about language and how, teachers and adults teach children language, and at first, that's pretty much all kids have of it. But once they learn a little bit and they grow and they develop, they start to pick up on new terms and new ideas and new aspects of language, without somebody directly teaching it to them. And I think
Mhm.
that's related to the zone of proximal, what was it? Zone of proximal
Development.
development. Um, I think that social interaction, and just talking with peers, and doing different things and having different experiences kind of closes that gap as we grow and as we develop.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like sort of just as an experience. I have a 2-year-old, or well, he's like 2.5 now, but like a 2.5-year-old nephew, and he picks up on like these big $10 words that I say. He has no idea what they mean,
Right.
but like he has them in his sort of vocabulary and in his brain, and then that'll actually like basically get him to climb up the ladder
Yeah.
of learning. So yeah, that's kind of I guess like that sort of zone of proximal development in action, I suppose. Um, how would you plan on using that in your own teaching style?
Yeah. So I think between both there's good things that you can take. But I would say one thing is just kind of being aware. I think it's important for teachers to be conscious of a child's zone of proximal development. Um, I think, and through that, like giving I think in the essay or one of the videos, I don't remember which one, said like giving guided prompts and encouraging students is pretty helpful for them as far as learning cognitive tasks. But I think something else too is group work. I think is beneficial because then kids can learn from each other. And I think starting with group work and then um, going off of that, you have homework. So the group work is in class and you're able to work together. And then you're sent home where you have some more work to do where you're idealistically working on it by yourself without too much help from your parents or from other peers. So, starting them in a group and do group learning, and then it becomes more individual to kind of test that that knowledge of the individual.
Yeah, that was actually more well thought out than I had. I was just sort of thinking of like the in the classroom aspect of it. I didn't even think about the homework
Right.
element. But yeah, I mean like I think it sort of is also dependent upon like the sort of subject that you're teaching. Like I'd be like I'm trying to become an English teacher so I think that in terms of English that's a lot more sort of like group oriented, I would say. Just because like if you're individually like say reading a poem or something like that, you're just going to have like your own ideas to go off of.
Mhm.
But once you sort of like include that into a group, then you start like seeing other people's ideas, and then you can sort of snowball off of that kind of a thing. But yeah, no, what I feel like what you just said was actually relatively perfect for both of them. Like the Piaget sort of learning idea would be like the sort of homework element, and then the Vygotskian sort of theory would be more in the classroom sort of environment. Yeah, so that was good. Well done.
Thank you. Um, and while we're talking about this, and these two fine gentlemen, one of my questions was, which theory do you think is more effective? Um, so I know for me, I think the uh, Vygotsky side is a little more modern. I think it really encourages teachers to measure a child's potential and look at, really try to understand where a child is at educationally, and then focusing in on closing that gap of the zone of proximal development. So yeah, I would say I'm probably more of a Vygotsky guy. However, I do think that it's important for students to be able to grow and learn as individuals as well. Because when you get into the real world, you're not always going to have somebody there to help or assist you. So I think it is important that at some point we do say, okay, why don't you try this on yourself now? And if they even if they fail, at least they tried to do it individually, and then you can, reassess the situation and then try to help them further so that they can ultimately do it on their own.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I would say like I couldn't really necessarily pick one or the other just because like I see the importance of both. Um, like I mean, growing up, I was always kind of like a loner, so like I always kind of did things by myself and like sort of made my own thoughts about things and all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I'd say most people are probably not like me in that sense, and most people would sort of need a group environment. And additionally, I know a lot of the studies that we watched in the videos and read about kind of say that like learning with a peer is actually going to help the student remember things better because it's being sort of bounced back and forth between the two individuals. So, I mean, yeah, I think it kind of comes down to like what form kind of works better for each individual. Um, but I'd say both of them are equally important. And yeah, I don't know if I'd be able to pick one or the other. Huh.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how they tie together too. So,
Yeah, yeah.
all right,
Oh,
should we move forward?
yeah. Well, actually, since we're on this kind of a discussion, so let's I'll just jump into one of my questions. So, my question was, how does the concept of scaffolding work, and what benefits are there to having students working together?
Yeah, so basically what I took from the video and the essay was that scaffolding is this set of methods that are utilized to move a child from the level where they're being helped into a more independent level. Um, so what you're doing as a teacher to make a student become more independent as they go. And I think that uh, a big part of this is the idea that a teacher has to have a plan and a teacher has to be conscious and aware of what's going on with a student to be able to really jump into that and to be able to attack that in the right way. And but it's not just on the teacher. Like the student has to be interested in their own learning and their own development in order for the whole scaffolding thing to work. If the student is just completely uninterested and unwilling to grow or try or improve, then you're essentially not going to be able to help them move up too much. Instead, you then have to find and use motivational techniques to get them more motivated. Um, so I think that's pretty much how I understood the concept of scaffolding. Um, so
Yeah, I mean, I kind of liked it just based on the sort of allegory that it was kind of coming off. I believe in the essay that we read, it alluded to the um, like what scaffolding does for like a building. Like so, if they're renovating a building, they'll put the scaffolding up to keep it steady, and then eventually the scaffolding will come down once everything's kind of intact inside the building. So yeah, I kind of liked that um, sort of allegory in that sense, just because it's the same with the kids.
right,
Um, yeah, where they like they won't be able to necessarily understand sort of certain concepts that the teacher is putting forward to them. So then the teacher sort of would then have to be that scaffold for them until they have reached that level of understanding that they actually need in that subject, and then the teacher can kind of step back and allow the student sort of stand on their own 2 feet, sort of, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then for the second part, I kind of already touched on it. The idea of having the students working together helps them learn, I would say, probably better than having like a teacher trying to give them the information, just because like when I was in high school, every time a teacher calls on you, you always get really nervous. But when you're dealing with like your peers and things like that, you can actually come to a greater understanding of things because you're not terrified that you're going to be wrong and look like
Right.
a fool in front of people. Um, so that's just my sort of general idea as to how working together could be beneficial.
Yeah. And then while we're on this topic still, I was just kind of curious and wondering as to if you had any personal experiences with teachers that really were able to help you close that gap, or if you had anything that you remembered from high school or middle school where a teacher really helped you out. Because I remember when I was in high school, I had one teacher who was really helpful and was really understanding and concerned about student growth and student development, and realized that working in groups helps. So it was an English class, and we would do group readings and group discussions, and then we would come together as a larger whole. And then, as I was talking about earlier, then we would have homework and things to do on our own time. So it was a really good mix of having that group dependence and also that independence as well.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it from the terms of like if there was a teacher that put us in groups when I was in high school, I can't even remember that far back now. But I mean, well, like I think my problem was when I was in high school, um, I didn't really put a lot of effort into it. So like if we were in a group, I never actually like really paid much attention to it. But
Yeah.
I would say like probably when I went to my community college, there was one situation that I remember where like I was in a lab, and it like basically you had like lab partners, and that was kind of like helpful just in the sense that like we kind of all had to sort of work together to figure it out because none of us really knew anything about it.
Right. So
So I guess
collaborating on a difficult task.
yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, but I'd say that's probably the experience that I remember the most,
Awesome.
in terms of the group. Yeah, yeah.
All right. So then just your last question here, right? And then we're all set.
Yes, sir. All right, so this one is completely off the topics that we have been covering so far. So, what new insight did you gain from learning about the history of education?
Yeah. So I think overall, just from the outside perspective, you don't always realize how much goes into a student's growth and a student's development. Um, so I think it was really cool to see and learn about how Vygotsky and Piaget came up with all of these theories, X amount of years ago, and we're still utilizing those concepts going forward. And I think as you and I are both trying to get into teaching, um, it's cool to see what it might be like, and how a student might not understand, or a student might not be motivated to work on their own. And, it's kind of our jobs to then push them and understand what they're kind of going through to help them close the gap and be able to work and function independently. So I think it was really, kind of beneficial to what we're trying to do to learn about the history of everything.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like the thing that I like, because in one of my other classes, we are doing sort of like the history of education as well. And like what I found relatively interesting about it is just like the various changes that it's gone through since like
Yeah.
the 1600s. Is like
Always evolving and adapting.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then like in the article that we read, we were told a little bit about John Dewey, who's one of the guys that we're reading about in that other class. Um, and yeah, I mean, his whole thing is like education is meant to sort of bring people into democratic citizenship, kind of a concept. Um, so like it's just like interesting how like when it started out in like the 1600s with the Puritans, it was all pretty much just like we need to teach kids how to read, write, and do math so they can be good little Christians and stuff, and like be able to read the
Right.
Bible and things of that nature. Up to like the 1930s when Dewey was writing, basically telling telling the educational system that we need to teach um, students how to like think critically about their world and things like that. So just like the sort of, I guess, progression of the educational system is an interesting concept.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, you brought up, how it's changing and evolving, and I think it still is. I mean, I'm not completely sure how old the videos and essay were, but I would say even since then, there's been new things that have come up. Now technology is such a huge part of educating. The school that I sub at, every single student has their own laptop, and all of the assignments are posted on there, and all of the homework is posted on there, and all of the grades are posted on there. Um, so, and we're talking middle school and high school, and they're talking about doing it for elementary school as well. So it's just a completely different thing that as a teacher you have to become familiar with in order to keep up with the times. And I know it must be especially hard for some of the older teachers, who didn't have that technology when they were in college, and they didn't learn about that technology, so they have to take trainings and everything to stay up to date. So it's really interesting how things are always changing and evolving.
Yeah, yeah. The world's always turning, I guess, right?
Yep.
All
All
right.
right.
Well, I'd
I don't
say
have any much else to say, so unless you have any closing remarks, I think we're all set.
um uh no, I feel like this is like an episode of Family Guy where I just can't think of anything to say after it.
Yeah, I think we're all set. We covered everything, so
All right, sweet deal. Okay, see you in 2 weeks.
yes, sir. Have a good night.
All right.